Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to tell you about some of the theoretical drone endgames, and you'll see what exactly I mean. If you look at this position, you'll notice that black has an extra knight and two pawns, which typically is an easy win in most endgames or middle game. However, there are certain theoretical drone endgames that make an exception when even a tremendous material advantage is not sufficient to win the game. For example, as we know, that if one side has an extra knight or bishop, and there are no other pieces on the board, just king-knight or king-bishop versus a lone king, that's a theoretical draw. It is impossible to win. It's called insufficient material, insufficient winning material. However, there are other endgames that are not quite that clear. It requires good defense on the weaker side to achieve a draw. Such are, for example, when one side has a king and two knights versus a lone king. That means if you have a king and two knights, no other pieces whatsoever in the board, against a king, typically the game is an automatic draw, because unless white willingly and purposefully goes to the corner to get checkmated, the game will end in a draw. So therefore, if you're in a situation that your opponent has two knights, like the positions you see right now, and has only another couple of pawns or pieces, your aim should be to even give up a more valuable piece for a less valuable piece, just to save your game and to get to a theoretical drawn position. And that's exactly the case right here. White is able to give up his bishop against black's last two pawns. So in this case, the only correct solution is bishop takes pawn. If pawn takes, game over pretty much, because here the only thing white needs to avoid is to go to the corner and stay in the corner and then get checkmated. There is no way for black to force white into a checkmate. But you may wonder what happens if after bishop takes pawn, black does not capture the bishop, but for example moves his knight to c6. And now again we have that very situation that we may save our bishop, but then possibly lose the game. Instead, the correct move is, after bishop takes, and for example knight c6, to purposefully and willingly making sure to get rid of our opponent's last pawn. Because as we said, two knights even are not sufficient winning material. It's not an automatic draw like with one knight, but it's a fairly easy draw. It's one of the easiest draws that you need to fight for. The only thing to avoid is moving into the corner. Let's move on to a next example where we'll discuss a different subject, a different issue, but again, one side will willingly give up material to reach a theoretical drawn position. What do we see right now on the board? We see black having 3 extra pawns, and then white has a knight against a bishop, which typically pretty much balance each other out. Of course, as we already learned from the previous example, if white would succeed in giving up his knight for all 3 black pawns, that would be an immediate draw, resulting in a king and bishop versus king endgame. Well, that's all great and beautiful, But white is not able to get there. The best white seems to be able to get is to give up his knight for only 2 pawns, and that would leave black with a bishop and a rook pawn, the pawn on a5. Well, what am I talking about? I'm talking about knight captures pawn, and then that's a check. If now the black king moves out of the check, black will lose a second pawn on a5, and after that it wouldn't be too difficult for white to give up his knight for black's last pawn. So therefore, let's follow up with pawn takes knight and king takes. But how in the world will we win that last pawn? The point is, we don't need to, because this is one of those really important theoretical drawn endgame positions. When black has a bishop and a pawn. Now, what are the important factors here? It's extremely important that that very pawn is on a rook file, which means either on an A or H file. The next important thing is, equally important, to make sure that the promotion square of the rook pawn is of opposite color from the stronger side's bishop. So therefore, if the pawn, the black pawn, would be not on the A file, but on the H file, for example, on H5, then the promotion square would be a light square, then black would be winning, having a light squared bishop. However, if again black would have a dark squared bishop, the game would be a draw. And the third, and again equally important element for this to be a theoretically drawn position is to make sure the white king will be able to reach the corner where the black pawn would be promoting. As long as the white king is able to reach any of these 4 squares in or near the corner, the game will be a relatively easy draw, because the white king will not be able to be chased out of there. The white king will move back and forth between the highlighted green squares, and black will not be able to make progress because, for example, after a4, king c3, king c5, king b2, king b4, white just makes waiting moves. Black will succeed to advance the pawn all the way to the second rank and corner the white king, but because the bishop that black has is of an opposite color than the promotion square, than the a1 square, the black bishop is unable to chase the white king out of there or checkmate it, and therefore black cannot make any progress here, because here the black king will be either forced to give up on the pawn by moving away from it or hang on to it, and that would mean the game is stalemate. Let's move on to our next example, which is a bit more tricky actually. Here we go. In this position, white has a clear advantage by having still his queen and moreover about to promote a second one. What should black do? Well, certainly allowing the white pawn to promote is not a good idea. So therefore, what black should do is get rid of that last white pawn and give up the bishop. But this will result in further gain of material for white, and white seems to have a big material advantage. However, this is another one of those theoretically drawn endgames. When a pawn is still in its initial square and it's a knight pawn, a B or G pawn, and the black rook is able to come to one of those highlighted squares on the 6th rank, on A6 or C6, where that pawn can give its support to the rook and the king can support the pawn, there is no way that white can make a progress that's significant enough to win the game. The black rook will just move back and forth between the A6 and C6 squares, and the black king will move back and forth between the A7, A8, and B8 squares depending on where the white queen is, and white is not able to cross through the 6th rank with the king, and therefore there is no way white could attack black's pawn a second time. As amazing as it first may seem, it's not hard to get convinced if you try a little bit with a friend or with your computer perhaps and try to play the position with white, or now that you know the correct defense with black, and you will see that with correct play it's impossible to win for white. Let's see our next example. And here we go. In this position, white has an extra bishop, which under normal circumstances should be a relatively easy win. However, in this case, that's not the situation at all. And the reason for that is because if you imagine the two rooks being gone from the game would be a theoretical draw, which is quite impressive. Well, knowing that, it's not hard to figure out black's move, which is rook to A5, pinning the white rook, not giving white a chance anything else but allowing the trade of the pair of rooks. And after that happens, even if white is successful in capturing that pawn on A5, which they can easily achieve by just moving the king up, all black needs to do is move back to E7 and F8 and stay right around there with the king. And as impossible it seems, but true, the white king, because of the limitation of the chessboard, is unable to get to attack the pawn on G7. And without the white pawn on G6 promoting, the game, of course, is a draw. The only way white could win this game theoretically, if black plays wrongly, to capture that pawn on G7 and then let the pawn promote to a queen, and then of course checkmate. But as I said, if black defends correctly between E7, E8 and F8, there is no way the white king can get anywhere near the G7 pawn, and therefore the game will end in a draw. Let's move on to our next example, which again deals with a similar theme. Here we go. This is a famous endgame composition actually by Perlis. Black has two extra pawns, which typically is a relatively simple win, especially here. Black does not even have a rook pawn, at least not yet. Remember, if black would have one of his pawns on the A file, that would certainly be a call for trying to then reach the so-called wrong corner bishop and pawn endgame, which we discussed in the very second example of this lesson. But at this moment, even if white could get these two pawns for his bishop, That in itself would still not be enough to draw the game, because the black pawn at the moment is on the knight file, on the b file, and not on the rook file. So here is what white needs to achieve. On one hand, force the black pawn to the rook file, and in addition, to get rid of the other two pawns of black's in return for his own bishop. Trying to accomplish that by pushing the pawn right away would not be the correct solution, because then black would have an intermediate move. By advancing the pawn from d7 with a check first, and only then, when the white king moves out of the check, capture the pawn, not allowing the same combination as we shall see after white's correct first move. So the correct first move is moving the bishop to a4. You may wonder, what should white do if now black blocks the check? Well, always keep in mind, in such situations, white is able to do en passant and capture the pawn, check, and then capture, in fact, the pawn on d7. Let's go back. After bishop a4, black is able to play king c7. And now, what do we do? If we try to do king d5, going after black's pawn on c5, black would easily defend against that and then have a winning position. But white has a very nice combination to save the game here. Namely, bishop takes d7, giving the bishop up. That's pretty impressive. If black does not capture the bishop, then white's disadvantage is only one pawn, and white would be able to hold the game to the draw anyway. But what happens if king takes bishop? Now comes the brilliant advance of the pawn to a6. Black must capture the pawn, since otherwise the white pawn actually even advances and the pawn will be promoted. And when the pawn captures the pawn, the white king can move to d5, followed by capturing black's last pawn, and then, just as we saw in the second example, white will be able to reach the corner and save the game. If right now black plays bishop d3, preventing the king from getting to b5, white will simply move to d4 and then move back to the corner and save the game. Let's see the next example. Here we go. In this position, white has a very significant material advantage, but yet, amazingly, black is able to save the game. And the reason why black can do that, black can give up his most valuable piece, capturing the white bishop, because after queen takes, the pawn advances to c2. And this is a theoretical drawn position. Black constantly is threatening to promote the pawn with pushing the pawn, and while white can keep black busy and not allowing the pawn to promote, the problem is the white king will never get the time to get closer to the black pawn in aiding the white queen from preventing the pawn to promote. For example, if the white king could be on d2, obviously black wouldn't achieve anything by promoting the pawn because the new queen would be captured right away. In some other endgames, when the pawn is not on the c or f file, but is on the B, D, E, or G files, white usually wins very easily because after a check with queen b3, the black king will need to come under the pawn, leaving the white king the time to get closer. However, in particular, when we're dealing with a bishop pawn, now the black king is able to give up on its own pawn by moving to the corner with the king, because if queen takes pawn would result a stalemate. So remember, the king and queen does not win against king and pawn if that pawn is far advanced, already on the second rank, one square from promotion, and the king obviously protects the pawn, and it is a bishop pawn. That is, a pawn either on a C or on an F file. After all these important and practical theoretical drawn endgames, now I'll show you something really exotic but very beautiful. Here comes the jewel of the week. I admit it's not a position you'll get in many of your games, but nevertheless, I think it really excellently illustrates the amazing things that you see in chess. It's very noticeable, black's huge material advantage. Therefore, if white would make the most natural move in promoting the pawn to a queen, and then after the black rescues his own king, white promotes a second pawn to a queen, black would still have a huge material advantage and about to promote a second pawn to a queen, black would be winning. Trust me, I checked it. On the other hand, white is able to save the game in a miraculous way, namely by promoting the pawn to a bishop. That's pretty amazing. Now, white is threatening to promote the next pawn to a queen with a discovered check, and that would be checkmate. If right now black king would capture the pawn, white would checkmate in 3 moves at most by promoting the pawn to a queen, and then after king h6, queen g7, followed by checkmate with queen h7. But how about after the pawn promotes to a bishop, black does not capture the pawn, but simply runs away with the king. Now comes the second brilliancy. White promotes the second pawn to a rook. But you may wonder, so what? Black's material advantage is still tremendous. And now white pushes the pawn to g7. And look at that. None of the white pieces are able to move. Hey, but it's black's turn. It doesn't matter, does it? And here comes the amazing part, that regardless what move black makes, it will still remain stalemate. Well, I hope you enjoyed this real curiosity, this real extreme position. And of course, you remember the more important practical ones that we learned throughout this lesson, the various theoretical drawn endgames. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.